Hi, Blastpop here. I'm looking at Battle of the Bulge, a Panzer Grenadier game by Avalanche Press. This is an older game in their series of Panzer Grenadier games. It comes boxed and has some limitations, in my opinion, of what is, in my idea, an excellent series. As the title denotes, it's about a Battle of the Bulge. It has a 2-inch box, fairly solid, although there's a little concave going on, although it's been around for several years. The game was published in the early 2000s. Give you a sample of what's in the box. According to this, the copyright date is 2005. In the box included is the 3rd edition rules. Currently, the rules are up to the 4th edition. I would recommend going online to get the 4th edition because it is a more complete package. While this has everything you need to play, they've expounded and expanded upon the explanations and information in the 4th edition. Of particular note, I'm not going to go deeply into this rule book other than to say that it's black and white, not a lot of illustrations, but it's a quick and easy read. There's no super complex rules or items that you'll have some difficulty understanding if you've done some wargaming before. One rule of note is the fog of war, which is an optional rule here in 17.4. I highly recommend it. It basically is a variable turn ending and kind of forces the players to get to the meat of the action sooner because you don't know when the turn is going to end, and it also forces the attacker in so doing to create a more up-tempo game in order to achieve those objectives before the game ends. Highly recommended that rule. Battle of the Bulge. Quite a package here. Weighs in at 72 pages. Starts off with the introduction to the game, along with terrain explanations and any other special minor rules. Also, hand in hand with that is the specific terrain effects for the expansion that are not part of the standard rules in the expansion. And along with some counter errata and event tables. And apparently there's 51 scenarios. Now, the scenarios follow a similar format. We'll use bulk holes here on scenario 3. It gives you an opening explanation, some basic information, turn length, first turn start, other special rules. In this case, ignore field hexes. If it's using one or more boards, what boards are being used, direction of north. Lists what the opposing forces are and what that force is composed of. Being a small scenario, you got 6 grenadiers, a heavy machine gun, a captain, and 2 lieutenants, your morale, initiative, and off-board artillery, if any. Likewise here with the American forces, and some more special rules, victory conditions, and then historically what happened. Follows sort of a squad leader format in respect to the presentation of the information without a picture of the historical situation included. Very cleanly laid out. Page through this kind of quickly. If you see anything you want to look at, please stop. Now here's a good size scenario. There's 4 boards used in this scenario, and in terms of forces, it's a little more meaty and is more to my taste. I will say So a comment that when you play the scenarios in any of the Panzer Grenadier games, this included, is please consider the fact that the system really shows its strengths in the combined arms approach, which means more forces available, where there's rich and complex interactions. Some of the small scenarios with just a few forces over a very limited objective, while good to explain how the game is played, ultimately is a lot less satisfying than those bigger force scenarios. Continuing along here. So there is a wealth of scenarios. And one thing I would have liked to have seen too, since I'm doing a little bit of commentary on this game, is the play length for this, the expected play length for this scenario, possible balance, who's favored, and maybe listing of the type of action, whether it's a meeting engagement, which I'm sure there weren't a lot in this battle, defenses, counterattacks, river defenses, or whatever, just to give the player an opportunity to sort the forces out and scenarios out to see what the kind of scenario that they might be looking to play, instead of having to pick through and try to find a scenario that might be interesting to both players. So there you have the scenario book. Also included is the system terrain effects chart, which varies from what I showed you before, which is the one specific to the rules in this game. A black and white picture, cost for the various types of forces, spotting range, how far you can see the forces in those hexes, and other impacts and effects. Assault chart, you have assault in this game, where you're actually trying to physically go in and take the hex from your opponent, and it's based on fire value, not an assault value, which is kind of interesting. Not a big fan of assault combat in this game system. Direct fire, 2d6, take your fire value again, and with a lot of modifiers. Tucked off to the side here is the anti-tank fire table, which basically is a comparison of your armor anti-tank value versus the defense as a differential, and rolling a die along with some modifiers, and then looking up the result to see what happens. It's actually quite a... The table doesn't look that interesting, but it's quite fun in its implementation. Also included is an hour chart, which is not the most useful of charts. It doesn't contain a lot of information for the players, in addition to the time, so it's of limited value. There's other options available on the internet and Board Game Geek to keep track of all your information that the scenarios contain in addition to the time. Counters, there's 3 sheets of counters included in this game. You have your infantry, armor, leaders, transport, and in this case for the Germans you got 2 different forces. You got your Wehrmacht and SS, and your Fallschirmjägers, which is the German airborne troops. On the back side, for instance, the transports are dual forces, because you also have trucks on one side, and on the other side you had the horse-drawn carts. Interesting about the leaders, when you choose, for instance, a captain, you'll take one if you need one, and then you'll take the counter and you'll flip it, and the side that appears when it hits the table is the side you'll use for the scenario. So there is some variability. Die cutting is a little bit weak in this here counter sheet. Almost off to the edge, but it's still readable and usable. I recommend that you possibly clip the counters if that's your thing, because some of the scenarios can get fairly dense in the system with markers and the number of units themselves. So there's and statuses. One issue here is that the armor units are not contrasting enough, in my opinion, to the background of the counter. There's some of the details on the tanks, which is of interest to players, can kind of wash out a little bit. Perfectly usable though. Your armor value, your anti-tank values, actually, and this is your in range, so that's your anti-tank and in range, and this is your anti-personnel value in the range, and likewise it follows a similar format. Your movement allowances, and it's on a thin core cardstock. I used to like the cleanness of the clean white cardstock, although I'm coming around to liking the somewhat thicker not cardstock, but counter sheet thickness. Although I'm not a fan of the brown core. I wish they could have a thicker white core. It just looks neater and cleaner. Looks messy, looks less old school. This looks more new school, although people haven't been in the hobby as long as I have. Don't remember the old days when the white core was heralded as an innovation, because they tend not to split and that kind of thing. More forces here. We got more Fallschirmjägers for the Germans to finish out that order of battle. And then similarly with the Americans, again, the washed out, I think, armor units. But again, fully functional in that respect. You can read all the numbers, which is really the important thing. Loses some of the historical flavor. Backside of the counter sheet. Next quibble is the sheet of markers here. It's, in my opinion, hard to read some of the information. Although, once you've seen one, you've seen them all. So it's not a big deal there. Bad color choices here. There are other counter sheets within the system that have the same information, the same type of counters with the different color options. I'd probably put this back in the box and not use it and use counters from another game if you have another game in the series. Additionally, either that or you can use these ones as an alternate color set in combination with another set to denote some additional information on whatever you might be interested in. Also included were 2 dice, and there's 4 boards, boards 9 through 12. These boards, while functional, have a more than one limitation. One, and it might be hard to see, is it's printed on a high gloss cardstock, folding cardstock. And depending on your lighting conditions, as you can see here as I'm waving it, it can make the board somewhat more challenging to use and play on. Plus, it's kind of slippery, so theoretically, unless you put plexi over it, you know, you might have a problem of slippage of the counters. They go sliding across the board, or somebody sneezes nearby, the counters may go flying. Additionally, they denote cartography-wise the differentiation in height by mere lines and not darkening or lightening the terrain or board in the areas where there's height differentiation from each other. While perfectly acceptable and usable, it's less fun and less interesting to look at, and makes, I think, the game a little harder to play based on my past experience with this game. I had an earlier version of this game where the boards were actually mounted. These are cardstock. I prefer the cardstock because the boards weren't particularly well mounted, to be honest with you, back then. And then additionally, terrain differentiation between what's in a hex and another, to me, is a bit problematic, especially when you have a hex like up here where it occupies only part of the hex, the woods. And then there's several examples, like right here, is that woods or is that open with a road? The road goes down the center between the hex side. Which hex is the road actually in? Is it in both? Is it in one or is it the other? Kind of messy work on their part. But there are other games in the system that they've really tightened up on their standards, and so I wouldn't hold Avalanche Press too hard to a standard on it, because they've learned from their mistakes. The system has been well developed over the years. Additionally, that's map 9. Map 10, a little more open with a town. What's nice here is the town is actually within the confines of hex for the most part, so you know that it's a open hex or a town hex. Even though there's a little overage here, you can know that this is actually an open hex. Similar problems though here is with the fields. You have overage there. It's kind of hard to denote what kind of hex that is. Suggestion: maybe players at the start of a game decide in advance what hexes are, what kind of terrain. By a gentleman's agreement. Here you have a trail. A little hard to see through here. Plus the board itself is a little bit dark. When considering it's the Battle of the Bulge, it would have probably been white features, or it would have been at least lighter. Would have been more appropriate for the terrain features. Big town in the center of the board, on top of a hill, which loses some of that effect. It looks, you can almost look at the board and not see the elevation lines, and lose some of the impact of that board graphically. So not a great design choice with those lines, in my opinion. And then we have a river running around a town, probably an industrial town somewhere in Belgium. These boards are all generic to fit the usages of the scenarios, as far as I can tell. Elevation kind of runs right around the edge of the board. Kind of looks graphically suspect and definitely uninteresting. Also, from what I recall, you do have a little of a trampoline effect. Now, additionally, referring back to the scenarios, one of the things that I encountered when playing the scenarios, they were not as interesting as some of the scenarios in the system, but if you like the Battle of the Bulge, I'd certainly give the game a shot, especially if you like the Panzer Grenadier system. In my opinion, this is a less than stellar version of Battle of the Bulge of the Panzer Grenadier system by Avalanche Press. There are some limitations. It's worth getting, again, if you have an interest in the Battle of the Bulge, and enjoy the Panzer Grenadier system. The subject matter interests you. There are some relatively minor issues that I've denoted in this package, but if you can find it at a reasonable price, it's definitely worth getting. I do believe it is currently out of print, and Avalanche Press tends to repackage and upgrade and redesign their games over the years as time goes on, to keep them in print and keep them somewhat more current and more state-of-the-art. So I'll give them that kudos. And it's not terribly hard to find any of the Panzer Grenadier Systems games. If you have any questions, comments, please note them. And also please like, and above all, subscribe. This has been a Battle of the Bulge Panzer Grenadier review and component review by Blastpop. Bye.